Day 830 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at the Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 510,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,270 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 14 tanks, 22 APVs, and 47 artillery. Then headed to the map and starting out in Russia, as we saw the destruction of part of an S-300 or S-400 air defense complex in the Belgorod region. With this latest event happening just mere days after multiple international commitments given to allow Ukraine to use some of their long-time Western-supplied weapons on legitimate military targets inside of Russia. And given, for example, that Russia has used S-300s mainly to torment Kharkiv and other regions for quite some time now, thereby having us now come to see that Ukraine is starting to capitalize on this new dynamic, as it has an extra ace up its sleeve at this stage, or 5 or 6. And so what we see here, potentially from a HIMARS strike, and looks to be one rocket launcher destroyed, one rocket launcher severely damaged, if not destroyed, and a damaged command truck as well. With the irony, of course, being that Russian air defense systems failed to defend its own airspace. Gee, Russia had more than sufficient warning on this front too. And to think, this is just the start of the new border clash dynamic. Russia should not have opened that new Kharkiv front. Then we'll head across to Ukraine's northeast, as various combat engagements are still ongoing in Vovchansk, with this settlement alone in the past day seeing the destruction of 3 Russian T-62 tanks, with a 4th one being damaged, plus 1 BMP-1 infantry fighting vehicle, and a 2 S-1 Vozdika 120mm self-propelled howitzer. And I make a particular point mentioning all of the models here because that's 4 T-62s, so these tanks, which were considered new during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then there was the BMP-1, first of its series, and then the tracked-wheeled Vozdika SPG, the one with the model number 2S1, where the 1 stands for the first model in its series, and was developed back in the 1960s. In fact, everything I just mentioned was developed in the 1960s. In other words, it's embarrassingly old platform usage. And then to also mention, as for Ukraine's newfound military capabilities for here and just beyond into Russia's neighboring oblasts, reports are now circulating suggesting that France has granted Ukraine permission to use the Scalp missiles for strikes on airfields in both Kursk and the Belgorod regions, providing Ukraine the advanced weaponry capable of targeting critical military infrastructure deep within Russian territory. Oh, and speaking of Kursk, where I mentioned just yesterday of Russian telegrammers stating that their military column traveling through the region got systematically targeted and destroyed. Well, we've now seen the material, showing that this was in fact a homegrown Ukrainian UAV attack, hitting the front and the back of the column, followed by striking onto all of the middle vehicles who broke formation into the fields. And this event all happened right by Sudza, about 10 kilometers from the border with Ukraine's Sumy Oblast. So with a wave of drones like these on the ready for an approaching column of vehicles certainly suggests that the AFU is running constant recon drone sorties on all main roads leading into Ukraine here in the north. The Russian military has always loved their main roads, perhaps making their predictability of movement their own downfall in this latest series of events. Then also, more generally in this area, we saw a new communication from Russian propagandist and military blogger Alexander Kots, who revealed a dire situation for Russian forces in the Kharkiv region. Kots acknowledged that their Russian offensive has essentially come to a halt, which we already know, at least at this stage, and he said that they are transitioning into an active defense. Also, he attributes this shift to the improved supply of shells to Ukrainian forces and their effective use of FPVs, first-person view drones. And he also noted that there is a gradual fortification at the reached borders, and that the Russian army is slowly moving into active defense because if they try to go any further, they will simply lose a large number of their people. Now, Kotz is an experienced and full-time propagandist, so his role appears to be preparing the public for potential difficult times ahead, based on the information that he's working with from what's on the ground so far. But it doesn't appear to be all quote-unquote active defense, as specifically back to Vovchansk, as a Russian soldier has laid bare the harsh reality of their offensive on the settlement, describing it as a meat offensive due to the sheer number of casualties. He recounted how command continuously orders relentless attacks leading to a devastating loss list. So an example that this soldier provided was that in the first night alone, half a company was lost, leaving only 12 out of 100 men standing. Despite these severe losses, he says, for this location, retreat is not an option. The soldier went on to criticize the leadership, highlighting that orders come from those in Moscow who seem indifferent to the troops' well-being. No surprises there. So it's quite the testimony, which underscores the dire conditions and the heavy toll the offensive is taking on Russian forces in the region. Then heading down the map and more central east, as we saw the result of a recent HIMARS strike on the location of the occupiers in Soledar. Then in a similar spirit, so somewhere in the east, we saw another destroyed Russian T-80BV tank in Vesela of Donetsk, which in this case is a good 10 miles from the front lines, give or take 16 kilometers. Then we saw a destroyed Russian BMP-2 with, miraculously, somehow, the drone deterrent on top, almost completely intact still. Then, on an innovation front, we saw a Ukrainian drone travel with its battery-assisted range of up to 6 kilometers to reach all the way up to a Russian dugout, carrying a more conventional payload of an anti-tank mine. So these tiny machines appear as if they have some utility. Then something else unique to add, we saw a Russian tank blow up on a mine, after which the crew disembarks, noting that both approaching Russian tanks were equipped with mine-clearing devices at the front of them, just when the tankies thought that they could drive with confidence. Also, you'll notice they were driving in the direction of two already totaled pieces of armor that probably met an earlier retirement due to their attempted travels in a minefield. Then headed across to a little bit of news for today, and I'm actually going to start off with a Russian hardware news update segment. And this is where I geek out. So the latest Russian Molva 152mm self-propelled howitzer was spotted on the battlefield for the first time in Kharkiv. This new artillery system indicates an attempt by Russian forces to bolster their artillery on the front lines. But let's head straight into the pros and cons, shall we? So the pros. It travels faster on highways and is easier to maintain. And to the cons? Well, starting off, the 152mm He shells it uses can only fire up to a distance of 25 kilometers, and that's not to be confused with 25 miles. Plus, this information is direct from the spec sheet details sourced from Russian defense material, which, if anything, is something they would normally overstate. Now, it's essential to acknowledge at this point that modern 155mm NATO systems can significantly outrange this Russian SPG, including the Ukrainian-operated Caesar, the Crab, the PZH-2000, the Archer, the Ukrainian-made Berdana, all of which have a firing range of 40 kilometers with standard 155mm shells. And so, given that artillery is a key doctrine of Russian warfare tactics, the Ukrainian-operated variants simply provide a strategic advantage. Then, to quickly list off some other cons, these Russian SPGs are less effective off-road, obviously. And lastly, they don't offer much in the way of protection against AFU drones, the same way that a Russian armored tracked wheel howitzer would otherwise. Also, taking a look at this video, the recoil is way too small, indicating that this video's attempt to show off the platform seems to have it only using 3/4 size propellant charges or a smidge less, which may potentially suggest the Molva system may not be robust enough to handle the stresses of firing full charge rounds regularly. And as for the production numbers now, well, we simply don't know exact figures, but expect there to be 1 or 2 dozen produced so far, and that might include the prototypes, with the project's inception commencing in 2019. But the biggest problem I find in all of this for Russia is, for all of the time, development, engineering, production, and costs involved to produce one of these $750,000 a unit SPGs, does not bode well for a cost-benefit analysis, given their shorter range and lack of protection afforded to these platforms. Now, at least with Russia's old Soviet stockpiles, their old self-propelled howitzers, they didn't require the effort or production. They just pulled the best ones out of storage and cannibalized the rest to make them as quickly as whole as possible. So what we see here and now with Russia's latest production feat is not at all in line with Russia's attritional warfare style combat or tactics that they employ. Because they can't just produce a handful of these cost-incurring platforms on a quarterly basis, only to have the vehicles be forced to cozy up a bit closer to the front lines due to their range limitations, only to have them destroyed in mere days or hours. Then headed across to a quick funny to round it all off for today, guys. But more of a lowbrow funny where Russia appears to be evolving backwards. As Russian MP Mironov has called for the abolition of the Russian Unified State exam, similar to the SATs in the US, and to do so for female school attendees, labeling it idiocy, and suggesting that it will lead to a situation where girls will never give birth again. Somehow trying to make the point that the stress of exams will cause young women to never give birth as a result of a, quote, hormonal failure. So he really starts an attempt to push this narrative on the basis of coming from a health standpoint, but still, even then, he doesn't sugarcoat things, making reference to Russia's impending demographic collapse. So Mironov's remarks reflect a disturbing shift in priorities where the development of educated, skilled individuals is being sidelined in favor of preparing more individuals for family and military service. How Soviet of him. Placing importance on military readiness and manpower at the expense of nurturing intellectual and scientific growth within the country. But he seems to have jumped straight to this. How about instead, Russia could expand their immigration policy via some skilled worker visa program and entice Europeans to move to Russia? Yeah, that's not happening. Russians have largely been trained to dislike any outsiders. Or so how about instead they could just stop sending off their young conscripts to war, thereby stopping the speed up or exacerbating their own demographic collapse or demise? Yeah, that's probably not happening either. So both of those might be decent suggestions, maybe not, but even then, addressing an impending demographic collapse typically takes at least a generation, if not longer, to see significant results. So Russia just seeks to evolve backwards instead. That's our classic Russia. So thanks again for watching, guys, and I want to give a genuine thanks to all of you for sticking around as we stick it to the mafia state to support any country's sovereign right to exist as a nation. So thanks again, and I hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!